How do you know you're doing a good job as a depressed anti-fascist parent? Well, you teach your kid to stand up for justice, even when all you want to do is crawl back into bed for the rest of the decade. I'm Matthew Remski. That was a Sad Trombones anti-fascist dad joke. Welcome to episode 8, Anti-Fascist Parenting, Depression, Hope-Whiplash. No guest today, and a shorter episode too, and here's why. Last week, as the latest tranche of Epstein files dropped and the White House edged closer to an insane but predictable war on Venezuela to divert attention from the files while pursuing oil reserves, I posted a 5-minute reflection on anti-fascist parenting and mental health to TikTok and Instagram. And I said in the reel that what I was about to describe might be a familiar feeling. And then I got this outpouring of feedback that provided some confirmation on that. And I wanted to follow up on it. So this is not sociology, but it's a good place to start. So it was a meditation about the layers of a painful conundrum. And I think I can boil it down to 5 main points. So first, as an adult with anti-capitalist education and values and a commitment to anti-fascism, you are more than likely stressed out and depressed because you have a clear idea of what's happening in late capitalism, from everyday exploitation to global inequality to genocide to climate chaos. You have a clear idea how intractable the problems are. You can't close your eyes. You can't turn away. Number 2 is, but you can't turn away from your kids either. Number 3, you know you cannot let your anxiety over these existential threats cloud or sour your relationship with them, even as you know that they will be impacted by them. 4, when you're overwhelmed and you want or you need to dissociate, you probably won't have time. In fact, you'll be called on to do the opposite, to offer presence, curiosity, a sense of possibility. You might be thinking of death counts in Gaza, but then have to whiplash into a conversation about the divine beasts in Zelda. Now, the quicker you flip, the less chance there is for the kid to see you glitch. But the quicker you flip, the more you can lose contact with your own feelings. Now, just a side note here, I think one of the reasons that Miss Rachel is so compelling and comforting to so many of us is that navigating this double space and that flip has become her job. It's her brand. It's what she's known for. And she seems to have the temperament to pull it off. And I think we get some vicarious comfort from that skill. But of course, we can't know the long-term impact of the whiplash she must feel in snapping back and forth between advocating for children in Gaza, starved by the IOF, and helping with the emotional attunement of kids enjoying relative safety in the global north. Now, I do think she has an advantage in that her job requires a certain conscious performance. She's not in those overalls and pink hair wrap all the time, so it's not just her own relations that demand her attunement, it's also the camera. Lastly, this is number 5, and as if all of this wasn't complicated enough, there's another dynamic. Your objective can't be to protect the child from reality indefinitely, but to expose them to enough of reality at the proper time. So you have to somehow help titrate their levels of disillusionment and resilience in the right alchemical balance while never making your own melancholy theirs. So today I want to expand on this theme of emotional splitting. And I also want to add to it a parallel conceptual and affect challenge that I think many of us are also struggling with, which is the problem that a leftist or Marxist mode of analyzing the world is driven by suspicion. Once you unlock the basic logic of exploitation, you're going to see it everywhere, but you're also going to go looking for it. And you will hear every institutional apologist for the way things are, from mainstream politicians to journalists to grade school teachers, through a skeptical ear. Understanding the truth of capital has a social shadow to it, because when you're surrounded by people who don't see it or who don't want to see it, this can reduce the capacity for social trust. You want your kid to be discerning, but you don't want them to be isolated or nihilistic. Also today, I'll leave behind the typical presentation format in which me and a guest dump info on you. I mean, even if it's good info, because I just want to explore this emotional territory with the objective of generating some dialogue about it. Now, I've said throughout my planning and marketing of this project that I wanted it to be participatory, and there is some of that going on with guests and collaborations and, cross-posting, but this is a next step. So I will be calling out for comments on this episode, and there are a number of ways you can get them to me. The best way, and this is if you are comfortable having your comments aired in a future episode, is to send me a voice message on Signal. Now, you can find me on Signal at antifascistdad.71. That's antifascistdad.71. That's my username. You can also find me on Blue Sky and Instagram under my name, and you can DM me there. And you can also consider joining me on Patreon at Antifascist Dad Podcast. My DMs are also open there. And you can follow me and message me on TikTok and YouTube at Antifascist Dad. So let's see what happens. Maybe we'll wind up doing a panel or 3 on this subject of managing this double but unified life. The last housekeeping note, as always, is that the pre-order link for my book is in the show notes. When I sat down to write the book this podcast is based on, the first image that came to mind was that of walking a line between 2 worlds. In earlier drafts, this section opened the book, but it got moved back because it was a little too much like throwing the reader in at the deep end. But here are some excerpts that I'll open with. If your family or caregiving life is anything like mine, you might feel like living in capitalism splits your life in 2. In one reality, there's the warm, pulsing uncertainty of growth and learning that pervades parenting life. So much cooking, reading, music, and videos, finding things, fixing things, and getting to places on time. Calling up the stairs or down from the balcony, finding socks, resetting passwords. Night sweats or terrors. Countless texts about schedules, groceries, misplaced objects, and I love you. Keeping things clean, offering comfort. All the laundry, gaming, colds, and COVID. Do we have tests? Bird flu is coming. Constant worry, terrible sleep, moments of stillness. There's never enough time to process. All the trouble and joy, claustrophobia and gratitude, all the love that drives us on. In this reality, there are struggles over space, time, sleep, and attention. The ongoing and fluid negotiation of duties and boundaries. No bookkeeper can calculate what is given and owed in love and care. This is not an economy of transactions, loans, and debts. There's no private property, despite what the kids think of their toys and devices. And although so much of it is hard, I couldn't stop giving if I tried. It is the way of the world that the kids will always need something, and it will always be more than I think I have. So my life pours out into theirs until there's nothing left of me. That's how we die, but continue on in their bodies and minds and relationships, following paths we cannot imagine for ourselves. If somehow we could live more fully and without interruption in this endless river of giving and grief, we might extend our personal life logic out naturally, without friction, into realms of neighborhood, community, and government. We might glimpse a world in which we do not have to strategize against fascism, because where would we have allowed it to fester? What inequality, resentment, need for retribution, or scapegoating would it latch onto? I mentioned a second reality. What can we say about it? Always pressing in, attempting to colonize this home. This is the world of debt, exploitation, trafficking, layoffs, evictions. Every interaction is governed by plastic cards, numbers, numb bureaucracies, and the threat of destitution. A reality where every bit of surplus value is sucked into a machine designed to devour more of the world. The absurd pressure between everyday communism and capitalist brain rot seems to ebb and flow hour by hour. They are never separate. Surveillance and rent-seeking seeps into all private spaces. It pings on the phone through a banking app. It stuffs bills through the mail slot along with notices of rent hikes or offers to reverse mortgage. It prompts us step by step through the socialization of our kids into overscheduled cycles of productivity and shame. It offers us the opportunity to monetize their achievements on social media, but it also tells us to pathologize the kid who isn't hitting all the benchmarks. It tells us to worry about our kids, but not how to be with them. It tells us how to help our kids get ahead in a senseless world for which we are responsible. It does not tell us how to help them help each other change its basic rules. Every day, overt cruelty streams through the news. My job demands that I pay close attention to the most disturbing stories. So it often feels like I've got one earbud in, listening to reports about ghouls destroying the planet while trying to keep the other ear open to listen with curiosity and hope to what our kids are thinking about. My body stands braced between the world and the child. How porous will I become? So that's where I started. And today my kids are more than a year older at 9 and 13. And fascism has accelerated to the point that trying to keep one foot on the political awareness and hypervigilance train and the other foot on the domestic platform of what kids need most at any given time, not the news cycle, not my own unprocessed panic, it feels like it's tearing me in two. There's also the isolation of it. I'm part of a lot of leftist online spaces, but unless you live in really unique, progressive, or radical communities, you may find yourself alone in this split experience. And to not be alone with the stress of this double life, you'd have to find fellow adults who feel it as you do, adults who aren't dissociating. Now, I understand the dissociators. Given how heavy things can be, I can sympathize with the endless schedule of activities that so many families preoccupy themselves with one outcome being that they wind up with little time to think, let alone grieve. I understand why Disney is a top global corporation. I think a lot of people need a procedurally generated positive world unfolding in front of them. That's what productivity and consumerism is. A seemingly endless horizon of virtual comfort. That is the relief capitalism offers as it strip mines the planet. But if you see through it, if you know how that consumerism both distracts from and causes the destruction of workers and the world, you'll sit there in the movie theater facilitating the child's access to wonderment, paying for it with money you don't have or that might be better spent on the poor. And these are all really conflicting feelings at a deep level. If you don't find people who see through it with you, a fair amount of your neighborhood social time might be spent talking with neighbors about dogs or sports or cooking projects. And if you're like me, you'll have some tolerance for all that, but it also feels like how autistic people describe masking, hiding their impulses and responses, tamping down on their honesty for the sake of social lubrication. Now, if all of this is tracking with you so far, I'm going to suggest that the first issue we're navigating that we can actually work on is the sense of being orphaned. Every challenge I've described so far is presented as zero-sum and fait accompli. It's the feeling that we ourselves are no longer parented and that we alone are standing between kids and the void. Being orphaned might be literally true for the person alienated from elders or whose elders have died or been killed. It can be culturally true for deracinated white people like myself. I mean, my dad is the youngest of 10, and those who are still around are scattered all over the US by college, military life, promises of social mobility. The distances have also widened due to substance issues. And I think for many of us, the promise of post-war freedom led to an acceptance of that suburban belief that you could just be fine on your own, that you could preside over your private piece of the landscape. So that's one challenge to think about. How can I stop feeling like an orphan? I'll say more about that at the end. It's one thing to feel like an orphan who has to be a caregiver with little backup. It's another thing to feel like an orphan who has to be a caregiver with age-inappropriate tools. And if you're soaking in a leftist analysis of the world, your tools aren't exactly fun. One of the reasons that Chapo Trap House does so well, I think, is that it makes Marxist analysis very funny, but really too cynical for kids. There is such a thing as being dirtbagged too young. The feminist scholar of gender, queerness, and critical theory, Eve Sedgwick, published an extraordinary essay called Paranoid versus Reparative Reading. This is in 2005. She worked on it over the long period of her cancer treatment, and she died at the age of 58 in 2009. And I note her death up front because I find it compelling that she managed to work on a theory of generosity while staring down her own end. But I suppose that's as it should be. I mean, as you get closer, you have less to lose, right? And I'm also impressed that Sedgwick didn't have children, and yet this essay says so much about good parenting. But then again, some of the most interesting parenting reflections I know come from feminists without kids. Emma Goldman, Rosa Luxemburg, Angela Davis, especially through her work with the Black Panthers, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Sylvia Federici. These women remind me of Lenin's idea of the professional revolutionary who's able to work on behalf of the working class because they aren't on the factory line. Now, about that essay by Sedgwick, maybe you're familiar with the sensation of paranoid reading. This is the feeling when every moment you spend in cultural discourse or news, you spend on the lookout for a problem. It's like you're waiting to find and isolate some deception, some kind of squishiness, that nothing can be fully trusted. And of course, there's good reason for this. The facts are actually on your side, along with history. The evidence for despair is pervasive. It can become even satisfying to collect it. Now, Sedgwick says that this mode of reading emerges from the hermeneutics of suspicion. This is an idea that comes from Paul Ricoeur, who's talking about the work of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, because each of these giants believed that every text, every cultural artifact that comes down to us is actually self-concealing, and it has to be decoded for its repressed cruelties. For example, Marx spent years, night and day, in the British Museum, poring over boring ledger books and legal records to discover the horrors of capitalism hiding in plain sight. I mean, I guess it's not paranoid reading if you're right, but there is a cost to the mood. Sedgwick says that paranoid reading is necessary to the analysis of power, but it can be stunted by an affect that represses creativity and inhibits repair. Paranoid reading, Sedgwick says, is anticipatory, it's reflexive, mimetic, totalizing. And it also has this faith that when everything's exposed, everything will change. It believes that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now, drawing on psychoanalytic sources, Sedgwick emphasizes that a powerful motivator for paranoid reading is the desire to avoid bad surprises and humiliation. She writes that paranoid reading, quote, sets a thief to catch a thief. And she also quotes Freud, quote, the man of suspicion carries out in reverse the work of falsification of the man of guile. But then she says that paranoia knows some things well, but other things poorly. So paranoia understands vigilance against all signs of oppression, but it can also struggle with the complexities of psychology and how people can surprise you. When you're committed to a strong defensive theory of negative affects focused on suspicion and the avoidance of pain rather than openness to positive or more mixed affects, you really set a mood. So what does Sedgwick argue for? She suggests that reparative reading can look for a text's empowering and renewing potential, focusing on what the text can offer for personal or collective healing and social change, rather than solely critiquing its potential faults or hidden harms. Now, she's not talking about being naive or oblivious to suffering or oppression. She's just talking about not holding up suspicion as the only way to understand meaning or the world. So I want to read a few responses I got on TikTok to that reel about walking the line between depression and hope, or in Sedgwick terms, between paranoia and repair. So this is from one commenter, quote, "It's exhausting. The tears I hide from my kids, the tension I know they must feel during certain times, feeling like I'm failing on raising them to be informed and aware while still feeling like I'm failing to maintain their innocence appropriately. It's a whole other layer to parenting that many parents around me don't seem to be engaging with in the ways I am. And we left our red state home turf for bluer pastures, so we're cut off from our like-minded and unlike-minded family and friends. It's all hard." Next one. "I'm a teacher, and oh boy, is this my everyday. The last 8 weeks I've been pretending to care about Beowulf while knowing my kids will probably go hungry because of the shutdown, that others may go home to parents who've been deported, and I need to be both apolitical and a soft landing place. It's crazy. I call my mom in tears at least twice a week." Next one. "I've worried about my own nihilism passing on to my child, but when I explain certain things to my boy at an 11-year-old level while trying to avoid a selective bias, it somehow softens the weight of some things, and it definitely leaves lots of room for discussion." Next. "I appreciate this post with multiple parts of my identity. I'm a PhD biologist who works in climate and spends my days looking at alarming data. I'm also the single mom of 2 kids just starting their post-college lives. And I'm an adoptee without known ancestry or any remaining connections to my adoptive family. So many of us were adopted into deeply conservative, deeply religious homes, as is reflected in the regressive politics of the adoption agencies themselves. I find connection working in partnership with frontline communities, fighting the oil and gas industry, and providing them good science. Sometimes we win and stop a pipeline, and I let my kids know about these victories. When my kids were little and expressed anxiety about the climate crisis, I simply told them, Mom's on the job, and it's my job to make sure the world is safe for you to grow up in. The message has become more nuanced and complex as they are now adults. But the dissociation with other adults in my life is still real. It's isolating. Thank you for articulating this phenomenon. Okay, last one. I super resonate with this. I feel like I'm living 2 lives and I have to code switch with so many people, but the hardest is having to code switch with my own kids while also not sheltering them, but letting them be children and grow in time. It's really hard to balance. And I've been increasingly turning to some traditions to ground me. So I think those comments speak for themselves. I just want to pick up on that last point. I've been increasingly turning to some traditions to ground me. If we're talking about combating the feeling that there's little backing us up, it makes sense. Many of us don't have parents or elders who are as radical as we are. Many of us will have radicalized against our parents. I imagine that some of us are lucky and we have radical elders, but they might be as far underwater as we are on how the landscape of fascism is changing. Or they might need care, or what they have energy for these days is grandparenting. And, that's fair. This kind of energetic dissipation or amnesia between generations is not an accident. It's the result of the active suppression of radical movements and institutions. Just as an example, in 1940, there were 20,000 members of the Canadian Communist Party. There were 85,000 members of the Communist Party of the USA. Within about 10 years, that's all gone. Because liberalism is allowed to pass its inheritance on generation by generation, but radicalism is not. And so if you don't feel like you have a network behind you, it's not your fault. They jailed or killed the radical grandparents. So what about tradition? I have to think that as hard as it is, any exploration of or investment in the rebuilding of revolutionary party politics would bring a lot of trouble and egotism and saviorism along with it, and boredom, but also a lot of worldly support and validating processes. People pouring themselves into cooperative roles with concrete aims. Secondly, my mind points me to this fact that I just didn't touch on in last week's conversation with David Antifascist. And I'm not boosting Catholicism here, despite the 2-week streak, because I'm sure that this idea is transitive to many institutional religions that accommodate, however uneasily at times, their radical flanks. So Islamic socialism, the Buddhism of Ambedkar, Jewish Voices for Peace, the Black Baptist tradition and civil rights. These are radical movements that enjoy the institutional and intergenerational support that always comes more from religion than it comes from political parties. Now, as I've pointed out, we've already seen liberation theology surge in distinct historical waves. It went through an explosion of popularity at the beginning in the 1970s. It was suppressed by a conservative Vatican in the 1980s and then undermined by CIA interventions as well. And now it's resurgent in the messages of Pope Francis and Leo XIV. So in this church, we see a global infrastructure of community ritual and caregiving. It's flawed in so many ways. It's historically complicit in colonial and fascist projects. It's still delusional with patriarchy and gender essentialism and homophobia. But to the extent that it can provide a home and material basis for the teaching of liberation theology, that looks like a kind of network of elders to me. A web of relations that connects families and generations to a shared liturgy. I think this has the potential for fostering a feeling of secure attachment, a radical politics that's practiced within a ritual tradition that baptizes babies and marries people and buries them, a radical politics that speaks to and supports family and working life and the environment, not just through policy, but through myth and celebration. A discourse which, because it is religious, and to be clear, again, I'm just referencing liberation theology and Catholicism because of my narrow familiarity. I think this is probably to be found in all institutional religions, that there's an attempt to speak to every dimension of life and to earnestly answer the depressed. So those are some initial thoughts in this territory. I would love to hear from you on how you navigate all of this in your parenting or in your caregiving life. And again, the best way to reach me is antifascistdad.71 on Signal. Take care of each other.